Welcome back, everybody, to our Bible study. Today, we are talking about Psalm 44, and this PDF that you're seeing up on the screen is free. You can download it on the To Be Like Christ website, save it, share it with other people, use it for Bible studies or whatever at your church, or use it however you want. It's here for the education of everybody. So, Psalm 44, the author of Psalm 44 is not David. Psalm 44 is authored by the sons of Korah, who have now been the authors of seemingly our last two Psalms, Psalm 42 and 43. This was a family of the tribe of Levi. We do have a New Testament reference back to Psalm 43, and that appears in Romans chapter 8, verse 36. So check that out at the end of the study if you have time. At the bottom of page number 1, we have our themes and our definitions, and we've got two themes and several definitions to talk about today. Theme number 1, history records God's power to deliver his people. And then number 2, the human response when God's deliverance doesn't come as swiftly as they expect or hope. Okay, so 4 words here to define, and kind of long definitions. The first one, maskil. This appears in verse 1, and the exact meaning of this term remains unknown, and so this is not a particularly helpful definition, but I can give you some ideas for what people think this might be. It may be a musical indicator telling the musician or the performer how the psalm was supposed to be presented. Other people think that it's a term that indicates that this was a psalm that was specifically written to impart wisdom from one person to another. Byword is the next word, and I think this one's kind of hard to define as well. A byword, if someone becomes a byword or a nation becomes a byword, this is kind of the idea of becoming a proverb or like a parable to other people, usually one that has a negative connotation. I was trying to think of a way to illustrate this. Maybe you have a friend who did something stupid in the past and there were bad consequences for it. And then every time you think about doing that same stupid thing, your mother says to you, well, remember what happened to Johnny, right? Johnny has kind of become a proverb. Don't do what Johnny did. Johnny has become a byword, a parable with a negative connotation. So that's my best shot. Okay, and then Jacob. This is one that we've talked about before, so I won't read the whole definition. The name Jacob refers to the grandson of Abraham, but it also refers to just the nation of Israel as a whole. And that's the way that it's generally used in the Psalms. He was the grandson, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Yeah, okay, grandson. And then the last word, jackal. Jackals are medium-sized canines that are related to dogs and wolves. They're similar to coyotes that we have in the United States, although they're a little bit smaller. In the Bible, they're commonly associated with abandoned places or desolate places. Now, let's break this chapter down. I've got 2 sections. I think it breaks down relatively easily. The first section is God's historical help for the nation of Israel. So we're going to talk about God's historical help for the nation, and then we're going to talk about Israel's present distress in our second section. So let's deal with verses 1 through 8 first. The sons of Korah who wrote the psalm, they begin by recounting God's goodness towards their nation, the Israelite nation, in the days of old. So this is in their history. God had helped their fathers to drive out enemy nations from their lands. He strengthened their nation, and he made them very prominent in the region. The psalmist didn't hesitate to give all of the glory for the success of Israel in the past to God. He knew that all of Israel's success was thanks to God, and without God they wouldn't have been successful at anything. He wrote, quote, "For not in my bow do I trust, nor can my sword save me, but you have saved us from our foes and have put to shame those who hate us." So he says, our weapons, they didn't do this. God's power did this through our weapons. So that's how God has cared for Israel in the past. Now we go to verses 9 through 26, and we're going to talk about the present distress that Israel is under. So though God had given Israel victory in the past, it seems now that Israel had suffered some defeats, seemingly some military defeats, around this time when Psalm 44 was written. And we don't exactly know the precise timing of when it was written, but at this time, there were evidently some military defeats that had been suffered. And the author kind of respectfully complains to God about this, asking him why he was allowing this to happen. He wrote, quote, "But you have rejected us and disgraced us and have not gone out with our armies." He says that in verse 9. Israel's enemies were laughing at them, mocking them, and the psalmist didn't understand why God permitted the nation to fall into shame. We just went through like First Samuel, Second Samuel, First Chronicles, Second Chronicles, First Kings, Second Kings, and again we read that God allowed the nation to fall into the hands of their enemies because they broke covenant with God, because they went off and got involved in a bunch of sins. But one thing that's interesting here is the psalmist writes that he's not aware of any sins that Israel's committed. So that's why he has this question of why are you allowing this to happen, God? Israel, he says, we're not worshiping idols. So if there's some, mistake on our part, like he's unaware of it. So the author kind of felt like God was hiding. And he asked the Lord to rouse himself and to come to their aid. Kind of reminds me of when Jesus is sleeping on the boat and the apostles think that he has like abandoned them to the storm and that their ship is going to sink. And they're trying to rouse Jesus from his sleep to get him to do something about it. It kind of reminds me of this situation. It wasn't at all that Jesus had abandoned them, but that's kind of their perception. He concludes the psalm with this petition, quote, "Rise up, come to our help, redeem us for the sake of your steadfast love." So the men of Israel were kind of depressed, and they knew that they needed their God, that God who had given them all those victories in the past. They knew he was capable. They were just wondering why he hadn't done it yet. And that takes us down into our application section, because I think a lot of us are going to experience similar things if you haven't already. There are going to be times when we don't understand why God permits things to happen in our lives. There are going to be times when we are faithfully following God, when he doesn't answer our prayers right away, or they don't get answered, maybe the way that we want them to be answered. There are going to be times when our plans that we thought were God-honoring won't work out, and we won't understand why. And I don't think it's wrong. I think we can learn from this psalm. I don't think it's wrong to be a little bit frustrated about that. But we see where the psalmist takes his frustrations. He doesn't take it out on God. He takes his frustrations to God, and he asks him about this. Right? We can take our frustrations to God as well. But at the end of the day, I think it is important to remember that God is God and we are not. God has reasons for everything that he does. He's orchestrating the world in a million ways, and he doesn't give us all the details about his work. Right? He never claims to. There's going to be some things that happen in our lives, events that happen in the world around us, that are mysteries to us as to why they were permitted to happen. But, maybe someday God will explain them to us. But again, he doesn't promise. His work is so complicated that we probably couldn't even understand it if he did explain it to us. So when our plans don't work out, when our prayers don't get answered the way that we want, and when hardship is the outcome of our faithfulness, trust that God has allowed those things to happen for a good reason. And this is another reason that studying the Old Testament is so important, because we're not going to get all the details in our own lives, but what we can do is look back at the Old Testament, look back at the other people who experienced these things, and see that God was faithful all along the way. God was doing something that whole time. And so we can have faith that although we may not have all the details, we can trust that God is up to something and he's working something out in our lives and in the lives of other people. He isn't hiding from us. He hasn't abandoned us. He's very likely shaping us in some way that's only going to be fully understandable to us when he explains it to us in heaven. But I can guarantee you that whatever he's doing in your life, you'll look back and you'll be thankful for it.